This forgotten hero changed the nation of Wales forever, despite having many illnesses in his lifetime. His name, Griffith Jones. Jones was born in 1683. He was brought up in a Christian family and very early on decided that he was to go into the church. He first of all was made a curate at Llanddowror in Carmarthenshire, and then he was moved in 1711 to a parish across the estuary. And then in 1716 he moved 7 miles here to Llanddowror. Jones was known as a really great preacher, and he was compared with Rowland, another of my forgotten heroes, who himself was viewed to be one of the greatest preachers we've ever produced. Even though some of his parishes were very small, one with only 12 families in, he would have 1,000 people in his church. It was said of him that he turned graveyards into churches as the people overflowed from the church into the graveyards. At this time, there were only 25 to 30 grammar schools in the whole of Wales, and very few schools of any other type. And Jones was concerned for the poor, who had virtually no opportunity to be educated. So he started to meet with some in this area once a month to teach them about the Bible. He discovered that the deep ignorance of the people meant that they had hardly understood anything that he'd been teaching them. As a result of this, Jones set up a school in 1730 here, paid for by his congregation. And within 8 years, there were 37 schools teaching 2,400 students. The school would be set up somewhere, often in a church, and 3 to 6 months later, it would move on to another area. The masters would teach the students how to read and the principles of Christianity. And the masters would be checking up on the progress of the students all the time, and they in their turn would be checked by a clergyman. These circulating schools, as they were called, were so successful that by 1748 there were schools in every county in Wales except for Flintshire. It was estimated that 150,000 people were being taught during the day, and there were more at night. Although many were getting barely enough bread to eat, they were all thirsty for more knowledge, and they flocked to these schools. Jones got involved in every area of the circulating schools because he believed that they were vital for the success of the Great Awakening that had begun at this time. And he was completely correct. So he threw himself with all his energies into the venture to make it a success. He had to make sure that the money was spent wisely, that the quality of the masters was satisfactory, and that the students made good progress. He would open the schools, he would raise money for the schools, he would advertise the schools, he would supervise the schools, and he would write books for the schools. They were not all Welsh-speaking schools. If there was a demand for an English-speaking one, then one was supplied. Jones must have had a wonderful gift of organization to bring this all about. The limiting factor was always money, isn't it always? He had to pay for the masters, And in 1741, there were 150 schools and there were about 250 paid masters. Also, money was needed to buy bread for some of the students who were hungry. Money was needed to buy books that were needed in great quantities for the students. And money was needed to pay for clergy and others to supervise the masters. But God supplied. Unsurprisingly, I suppose, there was great opposition to Jones and his work from local clergy and gentry. The enemy will always find somebody to delay or bring down a work of God, and this was no exception. Next, Jones set up seminaries in order to train people to become masters. And because there were not enough quality men in the established church, he had to go to the nonconformists. And that was not popular with the local clergy, and it caused even more problems. In the 40 years the circulating schools existed, it is estimated that half of the Welsh population was taught by them. Apart from the obvious benefits of education, the teaching of people to read and to understand the principles of Christianity enabled the words that were spoken during the revival to have richer soil to grow in. Jones was known as the morning star of the Great Awakening in Wales. He had an enormous influence on this wonderful move of God, not only through his schools, but God also used him in a mighty way to bring sinners to repentance. Also, he mentored most of the main leaders of the revival, such as Daniel Rowland, whom he also led to the Lord, and Hull Harris and Hull Davies. Despite his close ties with Methodism, he remained an Anglican his whole life, just as John Wesley did. Griffith Jones died in 1761 at the age of 75, and he's buried here in his church in the tomb there. He was a man full of compassion, and the impact of his ministry on Wales was very great indeed. One man wrote about him, saying, "Few men in any age or country have exercised a nobler or wider influence." Griffith Jones saw a need, and he had the revelation of how to meet it. It began small, but it grew until it changed a nation. Do you recognize a need? Can you supply the answer? If so, step out boldly and fulfill your calling. God will supply everything you need when you need it.